Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Ruby live event. My name is Chef Ken Rubin, and today we have office hours. Our office hours are a great type of live event in that we have students from all of our different courses, all across the spectrum of Ruby, from plant-based to conventional cooking, all together in a classroom where we could talk about food, and you can ask any question you want related to Ruby courses or culinary or ingredients, equipment, and so on. So these are really great events for us to host, a great way to connect with our students. And they're really simple. So as a participant, if you have a question, go ahead and type that question into that question box to the top right of where you see me speaking on your screen. And click the button that allows you to add it to the moderation queue, so we can have a quick look at it before we post it. You'll see also the questions posted have a little heart next to them. So if you're going through and you see a question that you like, click on that little heart. It'll pop it up a little bit higher so that I get to it a little bit faster. Other than that, it's really, really great to be here. And if I'm in the process of answering a question that you might have and I'm not answering it fully, feel free to send in a follow-up question. If it happens to be a question I feel might be better answered individually or more personally, we might just reach out to you directly. And if I don't get to one of your questions, of course, always reach out to us directly at Ruby. We're always happy to help. So I'm going to go ahead right now and just dive right into these questions. It looks like Sherry has a question about cooking equipment. She says, I need to buy a good cookware and a knife set for the class, as my old Teflon pans are scratched and cheap knives are pretty dull. What should I look for when shopping? I've always just bought what's cheapest. So yeah, if you've just got the cheapest cookware, chances are better than not that it's not in great shape, especially if you're using it over a period of time. My suggestion is really to number one, look at what you can afford, and knowing that you're making some investments that you might not be able to get everything all at once. So I would say, start with just the basics. One good knife, chef's knife, doesn't need to be expensive. You can buy a really quality chef's knife at, Target or one of the big box stores or online. Certainly you shouldn't have to spend too much money on it, but a good quality chef's knife that you could maintain the edge and keep it clean and sharp. And then just really one or two pans, a good 10-inch stainless steel saute pan or frying pan. Again, doesn't need to be the most high-end version of that product. There's lots that you can buy, maybe in that $50, $60, $70 range US. And then maybe just a quality sauce pot, something that's a few quarts, a few liters, for making grains and things like this. Now, that's just a starting point. Those are two types of pots or pans that will get you through just a lot of cooking. I look at what I do on a daily basis, and a lot of my work happens in a 10 or 12-inch saute pan and a 2, 3, 4 quart saucepan. So those are good things to look for. I would say, the cost, if that's a strong consideration from you, is going to be a driver of some of the aspects of quality, but not everything. You can buy really quality pans that are affordable. Look for sales. I sometimes even buy pots and pans at yard sales, garage sales. I purchased actually one of my very favorite knives at a garage sale at one point about 20 years ago. So yeah, there's other ways to find those products as well. So good luck. Deanna asks, what is the best way to freeze food? Glass containers with snap-on lids. How good are soups and veggie burgers good from frozen? So yeah, there's a lot of ways to freeze food. I would say different people have different levels of comfort working with glass. Glass is a great thing to work with in a home kitchen. It has some limitations in terms of weight, in terms of it being somewhat fragile. I would say that when it comes to freezing, I do most of my freezing in food grade plastic containers. So I'll buy higher end food grade plastic containers that are at the 1 or 2 quart size for soups and things like that I'll make, or stocks. I'll also have smaller containers if I want to freeze small amounts of sauce or things like this. But really, I'd say there's just going to be a lot of different options for you for freezing. If you're concerned at all about working with plastic, then working with a glass product or a stainless product would be your best bets. I would say when it comes to different types of foods that you might freeze, foods that you prepare using moist heat cooking methods, such as a soup or a stew, because of the nature of how they're cooked in their moist environment, I find a lot of those foods to be very, very easy to prepare and then cool and freeze and then thaw and reheat. Those foods do really well compared to some of the other foods that are prepared with dry heat cooking methods. So things like veggie patties and other sorts of things that you might grill them or saute them or bake them in the oven. Those, upon being frozen and thawed, sometimes can be a little bit dry. So just know that going into it. Doesn't stop me from doing it, but you might just apply a little more caution or care when you're producing them. Also, just be really mindful during the thawing and the reheating process not to let them dry out. Or, if it's some kind of a veggie burger, you could put some stuff on top of it to give it some more moisture, more flavor if you need to kind of ramp it up a little bit. But those are some general guidelines for you. Question here: I would like to avoid tofu in my diet. Are there any adequate replacements for that in the recipes? So Sylvie, you'll notice that tofu, and I'm not sure exactly what course you're referring to in your course experience, but tofu is used a lot in our plant-based programs to really do a variety of things from a functional perspective. This ranges from the use of something like a silken tofu to make a dessert or to make a sweet cream or a dressing, essentially adding body to a dish, mouthfeel, texture, those sorts of things. We also see tofu being used in those more savory, conventional ways, cubed and stir-fried or oven roasted and things like this. So the substitution, your questions about substituting something else for tofu, the substitution that you want to make really depends on the function, the way the tofu is being used in that recipe. So if you're trying to replace tofu when it's a primary ingredient, say like in a stir fry that provides body and substance and texture and all those things, then you're going to want to find some other food item that replicates all that texture. It could be using larger sliced mushrooms. It could be tempeh. It could be some other product. It really just depends, I guess, for me, what your particular objection with tofu is. If it's that it's soy related, or you don't like the texture, you don't like the flavor, and then finding a suitable substitute. Certainly if it's the use of something like silken tofu in a creamy application, you can use nuts or seeds or other ways to create that similar texture. Katrina asks, what fruits and vegetables should not be stored in the refrigerator? This is kind of a tricky question. There's some, I guess, variations of perspective on this that I just think are important to unpack just a little bit. So there's typically some things that in my household I don't store in the refrigerator, in part because I have optimal cold storage in other parts of my house. I have a basement, a cellar that has a very cool, dry area that has some airflow through it. So it's good for storing things like potatoes or onions or shallots, things that some people, even though they're not recommended in some cases, some people do store those in the refrigerator because that's their best option. Other foods just tend to do better flavor-wise outside of the refrigerator, but you're always balancing the reality of, reducing flavor on one hand, and then eliminating or reducing the opportunity for spoilage on the other. And the example I give to people is around tomatoes. And I grew up in New Jersey, the Garden State, known for tomatoes, really growing tomatoes every summer, really appreciating the freshness of tomatoes, the acidity, the brightness. It just tasted like summer. And of course, supermarket tomatoes during the winter don't taste like that. So there's a real difference, right, between those sorts of products. The tomato that has never seen refrigeration, that was ripened on the vine, and that just has a very particular flavor, versus tomatoes that are picked green, held cool or cold, and then flushed with ethylene gas to create the ripening effect and to give the tomato, physical red color, but also instigate that ripening process to increase sugars and shift the texture and so on. Now, the real issue is people say, well, great, you've got this beautiful red tomato for the farmer's market. Now, what do you do with it? Do you keep it out, or do you put it in the fridge? And I say, well, keep it out as long as you can, but not to the point where that becomes mush and becomes useless, and then you've got fruit flies and non-edible tomatoes. So I'd rather you put it in the refrigerator if it means extending the life, and that translates to you actually using it, even if it does diminish the flavor of that beautiful fresh tomato. So again, I know some people probably would take issue with this because they would say, oh, I'm just going to use it, move on. The reality is a lot of us don't get to use the product. It does go to waste. And because they leave it out, and here we are at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, for many of us, it could just be warm in your kitchen. It could just really limit what you could do from a very practical point of view. So when I go to the farmer's market these days and I load up on tomatoes, I know that I'm going to get a bunch and I'm going to eat them right away. And the others I'm just going to have to, put in the oven and candy or caramelize or make a sauce or other things. And then some, I'm going to slice in half and put it in the fridge because I'm not going to risk it being bad just for the sake of that slight differential in flavor by that point. So maybe too long of an answer on the tomato front for you, Katrina, but something I've been thinking a lot about recently in terms of that give and take, that balance. Sandra's asking a question here about mushrooms. I struggle with dried mushrooms. I soak them for the recommended time and then saute them. However, when served, they seem chewy or even hard to chew. Is the soaking that is not long enough, or the cooking process? So, Sandra, I would say many types of mushrooms need more than a soak before they're sauteed. I find that for me, mushrooms really want that warm, extended time to fully swell and fully hydrate. And, even to the point where I'm worried about how much moisture they do have when I go in to do a saute or some secondary cooking on them. So I love to work with mushrooms. I work with a lot of dried mushrooms, a lot of fresh mushrooms. What I'll typically do is I'll give a soak and, use that kind of quick initial soak as a way just to, provide an external rinse and just kind of pre-prime those mushrooms. And then I'll do a longer soak, and then maybe even a soak followed by a simmer, a gentle simmer, even just bring it up to the simmer and turn it off and then let it sit. And that's an opportunity to also introduce some other flavors at that point. So it becomes really useful when I'm building a mushroom broth or want to have some mushroom liquid that I love to use in risotto, or I do mushroom polenta with sage and rosemary and tons of roasted garlic, and I put in the liquid that I use to soak my mushrooms. It just adds an incredible depth of flavor. So I would say it's really during that moist portion of your rehydrating that you're going to want to maximize the soft texture of that mushroom. Once you get to a mode where you're sauteing or applying dry heat, then you're really in kind of a technique where moisture is being brought out of the mushroom at that point, and it's not going to become softer. It'll only become drier, chewier, more concentrated, these sorts of things. So I would say soak longer, and maybe even try to do something that's more than a soak, like a simmer and then a soak. Next question from Sharon. Hi, Chef Ken. I'm plant-based and watching my sodium intake. I would love to learn how to flavor soups, salad dressings, vegetables, broth stocks with the proper seasonings that give them the taste of salt without adding salt. So great question, Sharon. We have a lot of students who come to us who are really trying to reduce sodium intake, sometimes for heart health, sometimes for just really in the effort of recalibrating their palate, knowing that for so many of us, salt dominates our palate. It really overpowers and creates a skewed sense of what foods can taste like. So I would say, knowing that salt will still have some place or some role in your diet, let's look at all those things that can accentuate flavor, bring flavor forth to to your palate without having to add sodium to your diet. So one thing is that there are some foods that do have, relatively substantial, naturally occurring sodium. So if we look at, for instance, celery is one, but even more than celery, Swiss chard actually has a lot of internal embedded sodium. So when you use the stems or use the leaves or combination, you're actually adding some physical sodium to the dish that you're cooking, not just creating the perceived sensation of sodium or that perception of increased flavor through, other sorts of flavoring elements. But really what I would say is, use a combination of things. If you want to use, naturally occurring sodium, that's great, but it's still sodium. So if you're really trying to reduce sodium overall, I would go towards the route of, increasing things like fresh herbs, both the kind of woody, more herbaceous, kind of resinous style herbs that require heat, like your thyme, your oregano, your rosemary, your sage, those hardy herbs, as well as those more delicate, softer varieties, basil, coriander leaf or cilantro, parsley, these sorts of things. So really upping your game there in terms of the freshness, and also working with acidity. Acidity is going to be really important in terms of the effect on the palate. So when I'm working with low sodium applications, I think about all those other things that can add interest or flavor to a food. I oftentimes go the route of working on the balance of acid with some sweetness, and then whatever that kind of herbal backdrop looks like. Next question, when rinsing quinoa or lentils after cooking to stop the cooking process, are there any tricks to getting the extra moisture or water out of the grains before serving them in a salad? So yeah, Carol, I'm curious about the technique. When I cook quinoa or lentils with the intent of using them in a salad, typically I'll cook them the day before or the morning of, and no rinsing required. Just prepare them at a ratio where they're going to absorb all that liquid, especially if it's a flavorful cooking liquid like a broth or a veggie stock. So with my lentils, I'll go about 2.5 or 3 to 1, and just let them fully absorb all that liquid. So no draining, no rinsing required. I'll prepare them and I'll just let them cool. And I can even re-season them after that cooling point if I feel like they need more flavor, if I want to add some other components. But if you're looking at something just for the sake of time, you're trying to get dinner on the table, you're preparing, some lentils, and you want to cool them down quickly, really there's no way to easily dry those. If you were to do something like a black lentil, which really keeps its shape nicely, and suggesting that because of its kind of like durability, you could quickly cook that black lentil. You could either, like I said before, let it cool naturally, and that's probably the best way to go. But in the sake of time, if you had to cool it rapidly, you could cool it, drain it, and then put it onto a sheet pan, onto a either a clean paper towel or a clean cloth towel, and essentially just give it as much surface area as possible. So, rinse them, drain them really well, but then, instead of having them all in a colander or in a sieve, draining on top of each other, spreading it out onto a sheet pan with some sort of an absorbent surface would be the best way to go. That's a pretty labor-intensive thing to do. The best thing to really do is to kind of plan ahead and cook, chill, and then you just have your lentils. It'll also retain more flavor and more nutrients if you don't have to do that rinsing step afterwards. Hi chefs, our generous cherry tomato crop allowed 3 batches of roasted garlic cherry tomatoes. After mincing a whole head of garlic and guiding thumb forefinger were on fire. Can you please explain this phenomenon and share what you'd recommend? Well, gosh, I'm not sure what that discomfort was about. It could be that you were maybe just handling the garlic with your fingers and maybe just the garlic oil was just maybe irritating your skin a little bit. I'm not really sure. It could be also a combination of if you were touching that roasted tomato. Some people have a sensitivity to, just touching the acid of tomatoes. When I was a working chef back in Austin, Texas, one of the restaurants I worked at, we handled a lot of tomatoes and peeled and seeded and just a lot of tomato touching. And I found that over time, it definitely, irritated my skin. But I'm wondering if it's that or the garlic. Next time, one suggestion might just be to wear some food grade gloves, and that way, you can work freely without having to work about that. Don't have to worry about that contact. All right. So Carol asks, when you say high-end food grade containers for freezing, how do you know it's food grade? Is there a brand that you recommend? Yeah, Carol. So I typically just go for the brands that I used when I was a working chef. These are plastic containers that use different types of plastic than what you'd find from like a cheap plastic, like Ziploc, container, or one of those kind of very flexible, lightweight type plastics. So the brand I typically go to, there are a lot of brands out there, but the brand that I've typically gone to in the past for these higher end, heavyweight type containers is a company called Cambro, sometimes referred to as a Lexan. Lexan is just the plastic material that we're oftentimes referring to. That's just a harder, non-absorptive food grade plastic that's going to be able to withstand higher temperature and not, give any flavor and stand up to the wear and tear of restaurants. So it's a different type of plastic, different durability of plastic than what you would see from most of the sorts of things you can buy at the supermarket, let's say. Next question. I love sweet potatoes. So do I. I'm excited to be in sweet potato season again here soon. But lately when I cook them, they seem dry and have white speckled through them. What should I look for when buying them? What's the best way to store them? How long can they be kept before cooking? Great question. So there's a lot of different kinds of sweet potatoes. They range really fairly greatly in terms of the moisture content, the starchiness, the sweetness, the size. Some of those things also impact how long they can be stored and under what conditions. So I would just say that, for me, I keep sweet potatoes in the similar cold storage where I'm just very fortunate to have cold storage in my basement in a small cellar area. And I would just say that the best thing to do is to keep them cool and dry. You want to make sure that there's no moisture that accumulates around them. I've seen people store, potatoes in bags, and then once one of those begins to, give off any moisture, or one of them goes bad, it basically ruins the entire batch. So you can typically keep sweet potatoes for many weeks. These are foods that are designed to be harvested and stored. They're not, tremendously perishable. You can, I spoke earlier about refrigeration. You can absolutely extend the shelf life of your sweet potatoes by refrigerating them. That's perfectly acceptable. And it really just depends on what storage conditions you have. But yeah, cool and dry with some airflow is going to be your best bet. Next question. I'm interested in learning more about plant-based recipes. Do you have a cookbook or books to recommend? Oh gosh, there are so many books. I would recommend, within Ruby, we oftentimes will make recommendations of books or references or resources. I know in our plant-based professional course, in our Forks Over Knives course, we have, which are both plant-based courses, we have some recommendations around readings and such. But really, I would say the sky's the limit. There are hundreds and hundreds of amazing plant-based cookbooks out there. I can't even begin to kind of rattle off titles, but a lot of it depends on your cooking style, whether you're cooking for a family, if there's certain types of cuisines that you like, if you're cooking for a particular medical or health condition, if you have kids, all these different things might play into the sorts of books that you might like. But there are, quite literally, if you look at the shelves behind me, quite literally hundreds and hundreds of really amazing books. All right, next question here. Next question here. Oop, there we are. We are back. Sorry, we had a little technical glitch there. You back on audio, Patrick? Okay, wonderful. Sorry about that. We just had a quick audio blip there. Next question here. We are talking now about stove temperature and stir frying. Great question. So she says, Suzanne says, I have watched the video from Forks Over Knives, but when I believe I have achieved the mercury ball stage and start cooking, the food burns. So yeah, this is the real struggle here. This is the challenge. So when you are getting food to that mercury ball state, you're getting your pan essentially at a range north of 380 or 390 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you get to that point, that really means that the food that goes in, especially without oil, is going to have to be moved along the surface of that pan fairly quickly to prevent it burning. Now, I'll say in the case of stir fry, those little edges that are actually nice and charred and the close connection to the direct heat in the vegetable is actually a really good thing. That's one of the flavor characteristics of wok cooking that are actually positive. You don't want to create something scorched and burnt and on fire or that's ashen, but to have foods that have very, very highly colored, even black in some cases, small blisters, edges, that all could be very, very flavorful. Not with garlic and not with some other vegetables that can become very bitter, but certainly with cruciferous vegetables, with mushrooms, with other sorts of vegetables. So I'll say here is maybe you need to just turn down your heat just a little bit. Otherwise, I'd recommend when you put your vegetables in, just really agitate them more, give them more room to move them more quickly, and turn them over on themselves. So you're not just moving the same bottom surface back and forth, but you're actually turning over that mixture so that what was on the bottom is now on the top, and you're constantly moving it around. But it's going to require some fast movement that only reinforces the need for mise en place and being set up and understanding technique and some of those other things. So if that's still a problem for you, please do reach out to us. We're happy to help troubleshoot with you. It could be that you just need to move that food faster, or even add more food to just drop the pan temperature just a little bit. So next question here, question about dicing practice. So when I submitted my dicing practice, I included the diced round edges. I was told the pieces were slightly uneven, but they can only be that you throw a lot away or cheat. The steamed carrots look as if not everything is included. Why so much waste? So when we're teaching at Rubin, we're teaching knife cuts. We're 100% mindful that when you cut a carrot, let's say, which is a round ingredient, it's the way it grows, right? We're very mindful of the fact, of course, that when you cut something that is organic and natural, and you're trying to make it into a rectangle or a square, that you will naturally have waste. What we ask of our students is that we both want them to achieve the competency of the dicing or the knife cuts activities, which includes things like dicing, which do require that the dice shape is achieved, right? That is a shape that looks like a cube, and by definition has squared off 90-degree angle edges versus round edges. So we're balancing the competency with the reality of what their vegetable looks like. So we're trying to instill upon students the importance of uniformity, the importance of the technicality of the knife cut itself, while still recognizing that there's going to be some waste. So what you did on your carrots with your knife cuts creates a great opportunity to really think about food waste and to collect that product and essentially begin begin this thing that most of us have, which is a place to put all those odds and ends, all those scraps. So I have containers that I keep in my freezer that includes all the peelings from carrots, all the tops of onions, all the bottoms of celery, all these pieces and scraps that as I'm cooking every day I can accumulate and not throw away, but I can use them primarily in stocks. Now, if you've got carrots and pieces of carrots, you can chop those fine, you can juice them, you can put them into a salad, you can make a coleslaw, you can make fermented pickles with it. There's 100 things you can do with those little carrot pieces. So it's really more a matter of not thinking about it maybe immediately as waste, but something about, okay, I'm achieving this competency to prepare cuts a certain way, and as a natural byproduct of that, I'll have some waste, some excess food that doesn't fit perfectly aesthetically, but I can still use it for something. Now, of course, if you're just cooking for yourself and that knife cut competency is not as important to you, that's fine. But we're very deliberate about, in a course, when we tell our students that by the end of the course, they'll be able to demonstrate that competency, we have an obligation, expectation that the student's able to do that as well. Next question here. Good morning, Ken. I'm wondering if you could make some suggestions for substituting vinegar in recipes. I'm not able to have vinegar, but many recipes, especially dressings and sauces, that use that ingredient. I appreciate whatever recommendation you have. Gosh, I would say, vinegar is going to be really important. It's going to add a great acidic element to dressings, to marinades. I also use vinegars a lot with soups and stews to finish them, to brighten them, to enliven what might otherwise be a very earthy or very base flavor principle. And, I would just say that, what you're looking for when you're using vinegar is acid. So if vinegar is something that you can't have, find another source of acid. That could be, in many cases, some sort of a citrus. It could also be, something where you maybe combine some citrus and then some reduced juice of, some other fruit, something that might help balance that acidity a little bit more. So I might do lemon with some reduced apple juice if I'm trying to create something that has some acidity, but also just a little bit more balance with that sweetness. So it really just, I think, ultimately comes down to, again, probably what that recipe requires. And if you can make a simple substitution for the vinegar with some sort of an acid, lemon juice, lime juice, combination of those citrus juices, that's probably going to be your best bet. But I don't want to, underestimate the importance of acidity in these foods. It's going to really be important for helping to create a full mouth experience in terms of the arc of flavor, having the balance of acidity with the sweetness, elements of bitterness, those all become really, really key in terms of your enjoyment. Next question from Terry. Should I store roasted or toasted nuts in the refrigerator or at room temperature? Also, how long will they last? Great question. So this depends. I would say yes, store them in the refrigerator. Nuts and seeds always do better when they're kept cool, just because of their lipids and their fats. I would say the amount of time that you can store them once they've been toasted really has more to do with how old they were when you got them. So when you are at the store and you go to buy walnuts, those walnuts could have been sitting on the shelf for 3 weeks, a month, a week, a day. We don't know. Before they even got to the store, they could have been sitting in a warehouse for a week, a month, a day. We also don't know. So it's really important when you're working with nuts and seeds just to really find those points of distribution, those stores that have a lot of turnover of those products. So it's a constant fresh supply coming in. For those of us who have ever had a rancid nut or seed, it's like pretty off-putting, right? It's a very particular flavor that's hard to get out of your mouth. So I would say for sure, choose a reputable source, find nuts that are fresh, keep them cold, refrigerated if you can. And the same would go for after you're done toasting them. Allison asks, hi, Kim, this has nothing to do with food. I've noticed that since starting this cooking class, my fingertips are very dry. I'm thinking peppers and citrus might be the cause. Any tricks to the trade besides gloves? So yeah, gloves are a great thing. Also just a really good hand lotion, something that's going to really replenish the moisture in your hands. So something that a lot of chefs that I know, battle with is having to wash your hands dozens or hundreds of times a day. That plus touching foods that are, temperature-wise hot, and also touching foods that might be acidic, creates this kind of, perfect storm of your hands being very dry, very sensitive, and so on. So gloves and good soapy water and something good to moisturize with. Marina asks, is there a way to jump back and forth between tasks without having to go sequentially one by one? If I like to read ahead and then go back and complete an assignment, I do not see a way to do this. So if you just go to your course home page, that's the easy way to do this, Marina. It's a very simple thing to do. From your view that you have, you just want to go into the main course home view, and that way you get essentially what looks like a syllabus view. And from that, you can jump into any task. You can jump ahead, you can jump back. That's going to be the easiest thing. If you watch the platform tour video at the beginning of the course, Marina, that will show you, very precisely what to do in terms of how to get back into that particular view, so you can jump around more easily. But 100%, it was designed that way, so you don't have to, press the next button, 30 times to get to that task that you're looking for. I have some recipes from Forks Over Knives that call for brown rice vinegar. I have been everywhere, including several specialty stores, but cannot find it. Is there something else I could use? Yeah, I would just recommend using another type of vinegar. I really love substituting, I would say probably 3 vinegars primarily, which I really, really like to use. I use a sherry vinegar fairly frequently. I use a plum vinegar, umeboshi vinegar, which has just a tremendous vitality and a brightness to it. Also has some salinity. And then I use apple cider vinegar quite a bit. It's got a fruitiness. It's very affordable, easy to find anywhere. I would say that those probably are good bets depending on the specific recipe that you're looking to use it in. But good luck finding that product. Next question. Hi, I'm new to the forks over knives diet and was wondering what the ratio of raw versus cooked foods is. Thanks. Forks over knives, to my understanding, doesn't put any ratios or requirements around that. I know that for certain they prize inclusion of fresh fruits and vegetables, certainly the use of fresh fruits and vegetables for the purposes of the freshness and the texture and the character of it being uncooked, but also for the for the nutritional benefits of having some of those uncooked foods in your diet. But I don't think they have a particular ratio or percentage that they're recommending. Could be wrong. Next question. Hi, Chef Ken. It's always wonderful to be part of the learning in this course. Well, thank you, Barbara. It's great to be here. Thank you for joining. Can you please talk about developing variety in my cooking? At times it feels like I'm stuck in a rut, and other times the dish just doesn't do it for me. Oh gosh. Well, I think there's a few things here. One is, we're so focused on cooking at Ruby. That's been our mission. We're really all about getting people who aren't cooking much to cook more. So we're just trying to increase the frequency of people cooking. We're trying to really find those ways to make cooking more enjoyable, to make it more relevant, to make it more achievable, to cook and eat the things that you want to eat. But certainly, we all get stuck in ruts. I think that, for me in particular, during COVID and pandemic times, just not having the ability to as freely go taste lots and lots of different things, certainly made it feel like I'm eating the same thing more and this sort of thing. And I'm a person who's frankly fine with that. I eat lentils, multiple times a week. It's fine. The thing about being stuck in a rut is really about, what can you do? What are those things that you can do that give you joy, that give you inspiration, that might be a riff on something that's very achievable for you. So I have a lot of base meals that I make, things where it's a bean, a grain, a vegetable, a condiment, maybe some kind of a texture topping like some crushed seeds or nuts or some combination of things. And really for me, it's just about variation. So I might have some amalgamation of the same things all the time, but I'm going to, add more sesame and add more shiitake mushroom one time, and maybe add mung bean sprouts and seaweed another time, or red bean, and just really try to mix it up. I oftentimes feel like when I'm cooking for my kids that I'm just doing the same thing for them because they're asking me, oh, hey, Dad, give me, make me one of those things again. It's like, well, that's also fine to find comfort in those foods. And there's nothing really inherently wrong, I guess, with eating the same thing with regularity, unless you really want that inspiration. So I would just start with more variety, create the context so that when you're looking in the fridge and you're not just meeting the bare minimum, but you're looking at, great, I've got some other options. I've got some things that have color, texture, flavor, spice, whatever it might be for you. Linda asked, do you recommend Thrive Market or any other web-based company for ordering specialty ingredients? Yeah, I recommend them as long as they're going to work for you. So I have no affiliation or allegiance to Thrive Market or any of these types of organizations. I think that if you're in a situation and you have a need to have more reliable or better product offerings for yourself, I think it only makes sense to find those distribution channels, those stores, those retailers, whether they're online or not, that can get you those products. I have heard great things about Thrive and their quality and their product selection. I haven't personally used them, but I'm all for people finding those creative ways to help ensure that you can have the foods you need to cook the way you want. That's ultimately what this is all about. So whether it's an online resource or something closer to home, I think there's a lot of different ways to to go about it. Next question, want to reduce saturated fat dramatically. How do I make vegetables crunchy when sauteing or baking? Love these sessions. So, one way to do, vegetables without fat or without saturated fat, that's easy. There's a lot of vegetable oils without saturated fat or very, very low saturated fat that you could use. But let's just talk about maybe more generally, no oil or low oil cooking. And I would say the best things to think about from a texture perspective are really those very hot, dry cooking techniques. So think about, cutting the vegetables in a way where you could really roast them with convection, with the fan going, and get crispy edges, get color, get soft interior texture, but use that as an opportunity to have the browning and the texture and some of those more aesthetically pleasing elements that don't really require the fat or the oil to be present. It's just really more about the heat and the application of the heat to the exterior of that ingredient. So I would just say, certainly, you can keep them crunchy by not overcooking them in a saute scenario. That's one thing. Or you can make them crunchy in the case of, say, like a roasted cauliflower by applying a very hot, dry technique, such as roasting without oil to those products. That's one of my very favorite ways to cook vegetables, by the way. I'll just put them in with just a very, very light coating of just a tiny bit of vinegar mixed with a tiny bit of apple cider to create kind of a sweet sour and a coating. Those get roasted very hot, and then midway through the process, I'll add other flavoring elements, chopped herbs, other seasonings and things, just so that I don't run the risk of burning them too early in the cooking process. Next question here. Good morning, chef. I work in a commercial kitchen that has multiple culinary school graduates, and many speak of the culture of discipline and learning to perform under pressure. How do you feel Ruby addresses these aspects of the culinary profession? Great question. So that's a thing that we really can't adequately address from the practical sense. Individuals at Ruby, unless you're working with us through a partner at a work environment, then you're on the job and you're doing all the things that are stressful and pressure intense anyway, because you're an employee, and Ruby works in that context as well. But if you're just an individual and you're learning at home, obviously that's not going to afford you the mimicking of the high pressure environment that you would find in a working kitchen, with the deadline, with the tickets coming in, with a lot of people working in a small space, with all those sorts of things. So really what we're focusing on primarily are those foundational, those fundamental techniques and competencies, so that when you go into a kitchen, how to hold and use a knife, how to apply hot and moist heat cooking techniques to a wide variety of ingredients and different applications, that you understand the underpinnings of flavor, that you understand how to treat ingredients, that you're mindful of things like food waste or the source or origin of food. So there's a whole list of competencies and skills that we can address. That sort of pressure cooker environment is something that you can't replicate at all unless you're really in a kitchen. And I would even say that, and I say this having taught and run professional chef schools for many years, that you can't even really replicate that well in a cooking school. You really have to be on the job with the uncertainty and the lack of a safety net and the unpredictability that happens in kitchens. So that's one of those on-the-job things that we would certainly find. I would say it's similar. Say you were, in another profession that had a high-intensity type mode, like firefighting or nursing or something else. You really learn by being in it, right, and by solving those problems as you're working through. Next question, what is your favorite brand of pans? Gosh, I don't really have a favorite brand of pans. I like lots of different types of pans. I own maybe 6 or 8 different brands. I really like to use my all-clad pans. Those work really well. They're, I think, a nice balance of being affordable, fairly lightweight, but still very substantial feeling. Malviel is one of my favorite brands of pans. They're very high-end. They're very expensive. They're out of reach economically for a lot of people, being that they could be $300 to $500 each. But those are pans that I like because I know I can pass them on to my children. They're really heirloom quality. So for me, those are great. They are very heavy, very durable, have exceptional heat distribution and heat retention characteristics. Next question here from Win. Is there any reason not to microwave sweet potatoes? I was told it's far better to bake them in the oven. Well, there's a few things. Some people just have an aversion to microwave cooking. I find that microwave cooking, given that it's a moist heat cooking method and a fairly uneven cooking method in terms of how it actually, permeates in food, is not really ideal. I find that if I'm cooking something like a sweet potato or a potato or roasting something, that you really get a lot more benefit in that baking or roasting scenario, which is a dry heat cooking method, versus, again, the microwave being a moist heat cooking method. So, I make that distinction because it means that the roasting or the oven method allows for the evaporation of moisture, the drying, the concentration of flavor, and even the development of additional flavors that come with the heating process. So whether it's those products having the Maillard effect with the browning, or just having some other reactions because of the heat, those will all be building flavor for you. Whereas the microwave has no opportunity for flavor development, really just heat transfer in that sense. Question from Anna, do you still get the certificate at the end if you start earlier than the 90 days? I'm assuming, Anna, you're asking about forks over knives. Yeah, as long as you complete the requirements for that course, you will receive the course completion certificate. Laura says, I'm so grateful that I'm able to go ahead and get back to tasks, as getting ingredients and tools has been a challenge due to my location and COVID. Often worry about getting too far behind, but it works so far. Well, Laura, if we can be of any assistance at all, please do let us know. I know that our instructional team and our support teams here have heard probably every day, every week for sure, from our students across the country, across the world, who have had limitations in product availability because of COVID, or just slowdowns in supply chain and all kinds of other things that have caused a lot less predictability with where food comes from. So we're happy that you've been able to help figure it out, at least for the moment. And if there's anything we can do to help, please let us know. Deanna asked, do you batch cook lentils and quinoa once a week? I would say I batch cook lentils of some kind once a week. I usually, because of how I batch cook, have 1 or 2 varieties of lentils also from previous weeks. So I might have some red lentils that I made very simply, unadorned, unseasoned. I might have some black lentils or some green lentils, and then maybe some brown or some Spanish lentils cooked as well. I typically like to make things in a large batch and then freeze maybe 4 to 6 quarts of individual containers. And that way I can really have a lot more variability in what I'm pulling out of the freezer. But I do leverage a lot batch cooking weekly, and then producing 3, 4, 5 times more than I need for that week. And that way I can put those things away in the freezer and pull them out, let them thaw for a day or two, and then I can use them in cold salads or add them to soups or stews, or use them as a topping, or whatever I want to do with them. When rinsing a head of cabbage or iceberg lettuce, do you follow the same steps as when soaking leafy greens, submerging, pulling apart leaves in a tub of water? It's easier to keep the head intact for shredding with a knife. Good question. So I haven't cooked ice or worked with iceberg lettuce in I don't know how long, so I can't speak to working with that. I would probably most likely just use it in its whole form and just cut right into it versus pulling it apart and washing it separately. Certainly when I cook with cabbage, I don't pull those leaves apart. I take the cabbage, I take the core out, I cut it into quarters, and then from there I process it down into small pieces, whether I'm making slaw or for stir fry or for whatever recipes I'm working on. So I guess the short answer is no. I don't pull those leaves apart in the case of cabbage. Next question here. Just a quick thank you for your recommendation to try a spice or coffee grinder for small quantities that my Vitamix won't process. I bought one. It works perfectly. Problem solved. Awesome. Yeah, I oftentimes tell friends of mine who are having kitchen problems that, sometimes the solution is just a matter of taking a step back and saying, well, what other tools are out there that I could use? And the spice mill, the spice grinder, really works in that small volume situation. Of course, it has to be a dry volume, not a wet volume in the case of that particular tool, but it's really great for if you're just working with a few tablespoons or say under 2 or 3 ounces worth of product. I tried a recipe that left pumpkin seeds to dry 4 to 7 days before cooking them. I'm trying one for squash seeds that had me boil them for 10 minutes, then roast for 20. They don't taste very good. Is it safe to test drying the rest of the boiled ones before? It's an interesting process. I would say just depending on the recipe and everything that you're following, a lot of those techniques rely on air drying and just the lack of moisture being the primary preservative. I will say that, sometimes those nuts and seeds or those seeds of the pumpkin, let's just say in this case, don't have a ton of flavor unless you add something to it. So when I'm roasting my pumpkin seeds or squash seeds, I'll oftentimes give it just a little coat with some miso. Maybe I'll put some other flavoring agents on there, some crushed garlic, some chili, other things just to give those some flavor. Otherwise, they can be pretty a little bit neutral, a little bit bland, especially if the absence of salt is part of the equation too. So yeah, I would say when you're working with pumpkin seeds in general, I can see the second part of your question now here, Jill. Recommend just not overcooking them. This is another thing that I see when people are working with seeds is they roast them too hot and too fast. I would say that the slower process of cooking on a sheet pan is going to give you much better results. And also it'll tend to dry out that seed more and create more of that crunchy effect. Next question, what's the best way to freeze soups and veggie burgers? How long do they last? I think we addressed that one already, Deanna. I would say that, soups are going to freeze better than something like a veggie burger or veggie patty. Most typically things that you freeze, you want to consume within 3 to 6 months. Next question, what are the best wines for cooking? Gosh, it really depends on the application of the wine in the particular recipe. If it's being used to add richness or acidity, if it's being used as a cooking base, in other words, we're cooking something in the wine, like you're braising something in wine, or it's just being added as a flavor. I would say generally, when I'm cooking with wine, I cook, I'd say most oftentimes with white wine as a way to deglaze and to add some brightness and acidity to a dish. So if I'm making risotto or I'm making a polenta, sometimes I'll use white wine to help build a more complex flavor, cool the pan down, deglaze, or simmer out some shallots or garlic or onions or some other aromatics that I was preparing in there. Does roasted ginger need refrigeration? The answer is yes. I would definitely keep anything, vegetable like that, ginger, garlic. I would definitely keep that refrigerated. I want to start canning foods. Is there a course you could recommend on this? Gosh, I haven't looked for an online course or a course on canning foods. So if anyone from the group can suggest that, that would be great. Help out Deanna here with a suggestion on canning foods. Jill says, Chef Ken, some thrift stores have a good inventory of knives and pots and pans. I found some really good chef's knives and baking trays. I just needed to clean them up. Yeah, that's a great point, Jill. So thrift stores, I mentioned going to a garage sale or a yard sale. These are all great ways to find products. Certainly, you want to make sure you clean it up well before you start working with it. Great point. Christy says, thank you so much for doing this Q&A. What size glass prep bowl should we buy for our cooking presentation pictures? The ones I found are all different sizes and ounces. Well, that sounds about right, Christy. I would say that because when you are composing your images for image upload for our evaluation, you're going to have some activities where you might need 1 teaspoon of something, and you might have other activities where you need multiple 1 or 2 ounce bowls of something. So I would say a variety and assortment is going to be your best bet. Some real small ones for those, call it under 1 tablespoon type measurements, but certainly larger ones where you might be able to accommodate a few ounces. I would say generally my bowls that I use for mise en place are under 4 ounces, unless they're like a stainless steel bowl where I'm holding primary product. But for small things, spices, oils, salt, these sorts of things, just little 1/4 cup or 1/2 cup bowls are perfect. Next question. This is a really good question here, actually. I struggle with having too much food because I'm cooking for one and throwing things out. Suggestions? Julie, it is a constant struggle. I think you're not alone in, we already referenced food waste earlier on today's event, but you're not alone in this concern around just having too much food and having the abundance go to waste. So, one suggestion I would say within our Ruby courses is you can always, or not always, but 99.5% of the time, you can cut the recipe down. You can cut it in half. You can even cut it down more in some cases, and the recipe won't suffer. I say not always, but most of the time, because there are some recipes that just require some amount of volume to work, to be blended, to be mixed, to be cooked, and so on. You can't start with such a small amount, just in some small instances. But one thing to start would be just reduce the yield of your recipe. And that's literally looking at the recipe list and the ingredient list and just cutting everything in half, right? So if it calls for 2 cups, you make 1 cup. If it calls for 1 ounce, you put in 1/2 ounce. Other than that, your procedures, your process shouldn't really change. You might have some small changes of timing on a dish and things like that, but otherwise you're following that same procedure. Important topic to bring up, Julie. I would say that the subject of food waste, especially during times when there are so many people who just simply don't have enough, are important to bring light to. Catherine says, I'm wondering if there's any use for the skimmings we get for making stock, especially toward the end when there isn't as much scum on the surface. So I would say if you're making a stock and you have some foam or what we call like a stock scum on top, I would say, one thing you can do is just skim that off, being careful not to take away much or any stock with you. Really, you see most of it at the beginning of the stock cooking process, but even towards the end, you might see it. So I would just say, just be mindful of that, skim it, but yeah, don't take too much of the actual, liquid stock with you if you can. Wet and dry measure. When I measure 8 ounces of rolled oats, for example, it is a heaping cup in my dry measuring cup, which I believe is supposed to be leveled. It's generally better to go by measuring cup amount or the actual weight amount in a recipe. Great. Yeah, great question. So when we are talking about 8 ounces of oats, let's say, that does refer to both a volume measure as well as a weight measure. So I would say if you're looking at 8 ounces, that's 1 cup of oats, right? And I would say go ahead and take your measuring cup. That's 8 ounces, and fill it, level it. Great. That's going to give you your 8 ounces. Your 8 ounces of weight is going to be a different volume. I would say most of our recipes are really using volume as their primary mode of measurement. So that would be what I do is, use the measuring cup, not the scale in this case. See how it turns out. Of course, like any recipe, you're going to want to adapt and adjust and so on as you need to. But let us know how that works for you. Next question here. Also, in my first assignment, I realized that I accidentally included some of my personal notes in the description I submitted with my photos. Whoops. How do errors and typos like this affect marks? Thank you. I'd have to see what kind of marks you got on that. Oftentimes, chef instructors just want to see that you're able to do the activity and articulate it clearly. If you included some additional things, that typically shouldn't detract from your grade unless it was confusing or contradictory to what you had otherwise presented. Next question. Hello, Chef Ken. When on dashboard, is there a search feature that I'm missing if you want to look for a specific recipe without having to go sequentially? Also, if a recipe calls for baking powder, do I assume it means alum-free or double acting? All right, so if you are looking for recipes in your course and you want to find a way that's not going task by task, one thing I'll recommend when you're in your course home view, there's a little link underneath that header that actually allows you to show lesson videos and also practice recipes from the course. So from that view, you should be able to make a link and have both links to lessons as well as recipes. It's not really a search function. It's really just more of a page that will give you kind of a grid style visualization of all of those recipes in the course. So maybe not what you're looking for exactly. If you have a particular recipe you're trying to find and you can't find it, if you want to give us a buzz, someone on our team can certainly help you and point you in the right direction. When it comes to the baking powder, you can usually use either the alum-free or the double acting. The double acting typically is going to be just a little bit more potent than the alum-free, but really both should work equally well in those recipes as a leavening, as a chemical leavening agent. Next question. Is wine vinegar the healthiest vinegar? I understand rice products, rice vinegar has high amounts of arsenic from soil because of the way rice is grown. So yeah, if you have a concern with rice products, there has been a lot of recent media and research around brown rice in particular having arsenic. I would say if you have any concerns about rice at all, just choose some other type of vinegar. You can choose a sherry vinegar made from sherry wine. You can choose champagne vinegar. I love using balsamic vinegar, white balsamic or a traditional balsamic. I mentioned plum vinegar earlier. There's a lot of different types of vinegar out there besides rice wine vinegar. So if that's a product that concerns you, and you just choose another vinegar. Next question from Patricia. I'm eating vegetable corn as I watch. Amazing. That's great. I'm so happy for you. Would love more cultural recipes or even a class, please. I cook with Ruby every day. Super enjoying. And my cooking sure has improved. Thank you. Well, thank you. That just gives me so much happiness to know that you're eating some great food right now. and also that you're looking forward to your cooking being improved, and hopefully we can help expand your horizons with additional courses and content. Certainly something that we're looking at doing, and stay tuned. We have a lot of things in the works in the upcoming months with us. So next question here, Chef, where can I get a recipe for gluten-free bread? I've tried a lot of them, but the bread is never good. Gosh, this is a real tough one. I would say, that there are some really great resources on Ruby around gluten-free. I would say that the best results we see from gluten-free products don't really come in that form of like a big loaf bread. They tend to be flat breads or quick breads or other sorts of products that don't look and feel like a traditional loaf of bread. There are many amazing super smart gluten-free bakery experts out there, and my guess is that with some searching online, and I haven't done this research, but with some searching online, you can probably find some really great renditions of bread, knowing that some of them are going to lean towards the direction of having more refined starches. Some might be made more with ground up nut or seed meal or seed flours, or some might be a combination of things. But really, anytime you're working with these gluten-free products, you're making some trade-offs for texture, flavor, the structure of the bread, the physical outward appearance versus the way it feels in your mouth. Some of these breads also, I'll just say, might in some cases look really good, but also have a texture, a mouthfeel that's not as satisfying, almost a sliminess or a softness that just dissolves differently on your tongue than what you might want or what you might expect. So I always encourage people when they're kind of doing the gluten-free flour bread thing to figure out, like, what is it you want from that bread? Do you want it to be a base of something? Do you need it to be a sandwich with a top and a bottom? Are you looking just for small amounts of texture? Like, what are you really going for with that bread product? Next question, should flours be stored in the fridge? Yeah, so anytime you have the ability to store grains, flours, nuts, or seeds in particular in a cool or cold environment, I would recommend it. Now, most of us don't have the space, right, to put our flour in the fridge, but it would be a very good way to increase the shelf life of those products. During COVID, I've been buying and baking a lot more, buying a lot more flour than I typically had been, and also buying it directly so I can buy the particular types of flour that I like. And I happen to be just very, very close, about a mile away from the Bob's Red Mill world headquarters. I live in Portland, and Bob's Red Mill is just south of us, about 1 mile. And I was able to get some whole wheat flour from Bob's Red Mill, but I had to buy it in a 50-pound bag. And that's perfectly fine, but because I'm going to be sharing it with my family. But the real question was, well, like, now that we have 50 pounds of whole wheat flour, what do we do? How do we store it? So essentially, we're just dividing up that bag, putting it into smaller bags, and then those bags individually can be more easily, more reasonably fit into refrigeration or even the freezer for longer term storage. But part of my thinking with that was, okay, well, number one, we can do some refrigeration because I have excess refrigeration space. But number two, we can also just divide it up and get it to more people so that we have less issues around waste, but I'm still able to buy that big bag of flour and make whole wheat bread and whole wheat pita and other sorts of things that I like to make. Back to pans. Can you talk about carbon steel pans? Advantages, disadvantages? Do you recommend them? Yeah, I use carbon steel pans. They're not quite as easy to maintain as a stainless steel pan, and they don't quite give the heat retention and evenness that a cast iron pan has. So they're oftentimes kind of left out of the mix. But I like using carbon steel pans for sautéing, for hot cooking. Oftentimes I'll even use the pan just as a small roasting pan. So I might start something on top of the stove and then put it in the oven to finish in a carbon steel pan. They're great. They're fairly lightweight compared to other pans, and that's the only downside. But as a result, they heat up very, very quickly. Jill has a question. I have a recipe for a mushroom burger that I want to convert to vegan. The recipe calls for an egg. What is a comparable substitute? Not flax. So, one thing you could do is some aquafaba. So a small amount of reduced aquafaba just made from chickpea water might help with a little bit of binding. But I would just say, just add a little bit of starch. Like your best bet in this scenario is you just need something to help bind and make sure that your moisture level is not out of balance. So I would add maybe just a small amount of potato starch or cornstarch or even arrowroot powder. Anything that's going to be absorbent and starchy is probably going to get you to a point where, as long as you're not, manipulating that mushroom patty too much and futzing with it, that it'll hold together. So hopefully that helps. That looks like all the questions we had for today. Really amazing group. So happy to be helpful to all of you with your questions, especially those questions that came up today about utilizing product and food waste and those themes. Those are very, very important to me personally, and things that I've struggled with, just sort of getting my head around. We have on one hand this amazing abundance, the ability to cook food and to have an excess of food, and on the other hand, we have to always manage, what happened with my scraps? Did I turn all the things that are edible into actual things that people can eat? Am I eating all of it? Am I just frankly preparing too much food? And I've fallen into that as well, where on some cold winter days, I just find myself cooking and cooking and cooking, and then I have to find ways to distribute and get rid of all my food. But typically not too much of a problem. My neighbors seem to appreciate it. Gonna go ahead and sign off and just thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you in class. If there were any questions we couldn't get to today, please do drop us a line. We're always here to help. And until next time, happy cooking and take care.